welcome to Freethinking 101. Tonight we invite you to examine some of your ideas, to challenge your thinking, and to look into some of the recesses of your mind and question some of the ideas that you might find there. I'm Barbara Hamill-Stocker of the Rationalist Society of St. Louis. We have with us tonight Pat Inniss, who's been doing some examination of the Bible. Pat, the Bible is perhaps one of the most widely purchased books in the world, but is it read that much? Many people are familiar with some of the outrageous material in the Old Testament. Does the New Testament have anything to offer in this area?
Well, it certainly does, Barbara. You know, the distinction you made about the widely purchased book is a very important one because, I mean, it's a very large book, first of all. I guess that's the impression I always had when I thought about the Bible, was it was almost unapproachable because of its sheer volume. But a lot of people have focused on this spectacular things that happened in the Bible, you know, Jonah being swallowed up by the whale, the separation of the seas before Moses, and these types of things. And, you know, that's great, but the thing, from a free thinker's point of view in dealing with Christians, I sort of feel you should focus on the New Testament. In a way, it's not as exciting as the Old Testament. You don't have this sun being stopped in the middle of the sky, so somebody get to the whole heart of the issue, which is the divinity of Christ.
Mm-hmm. But you almost get the impression that many Christians would like to disavow the Old Testament because of all the violence, greed, lasciviousness.
Lasciviousness.
Lasciviousness,
Yes.
that's it. and similar faults portrayed there.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's true. That, you know, a lot of times when you bring up some of the really bizarre things that happen in the Old Testament, you know, in the course of a discussion, a Christian, a religionist may try to distance himself from these things. He'll say, well, that's Old Testament, and we conduct society, Christian society, under the new law, now the New Testament. You know, that's true. But really, when you look at it, it's Christ himself did, well, in Matthew, I can read this for you right quick, Matthew 5:18, Christ gives a pretty strong endorsement to the Old Testament. He says, remember this, as long as heaven and earth last, the least point or the smallest detail of the law will not be done away with. He's talking about the Old Testament, of course, not until the end of all things. Christ thought the Old Testament was to be taken literally, apparently, and really to be observed until the end of time, if you want to put it in those terms. Now, throughout history, of course, the exact constitution of the Bible, not just the New Testament, but the Old Testament too, has been really subject to a lot of continuing controversy. A lot of, any number of meetings, you know, leaders of the Catholic Church, I guess, historically have gotten together when they were formulating the Bible. Then at the times that the Bible was, you know, being rewritten to satisfy the needs, oftentimes the political needs of the people that were rewriting it to bolster their authority. They've taken things in and put things out and retranslated things. But, you know, I mean, the controversy continues even to this day. Matter of fact, well, Luther rejected the divine inspiration of the book of Revelations. It was a little too weird for him, and one can understand why. Of course, for a lot of free thinkers, the whole thing is a little weird. So,
well, the principle of divine inspiration would seem to jeopardize be jeopardized by the presence of errors in the Bible, wouldn't it?
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know, Christians don't like to talk about that, you know. I mean, the fact that there are, you know, numerous errors strewn throughout the Bible. If you go visit the library, for instance, you can find shelves and shelves and shelves of of books dealing with the Scriptures and, you know, other, well, tangentially with that reference the Scriptures. But there's also a large body of literature out there which does critical evaluations of the Scriptures. Very few of those are found in the libraries. It's very, you know, for somebody that isn't aware, you know, like many Christians seem to be, they don't really come to grips with the fact that they're fully aware of what I would call the absurdities, the so-called miracles, things that happen in the Bible that just don't follow what we know of nature, but they're not really aware of the inconsistencies. Now, if you read the Bible, coming back again to the New Testament, you do find that they're fairly consistent internally. The different sections of the Bible, the Gospels, or by specific authors, are fairly consistent. But what happens is, since the Bible was put together of many pieces, when you compare across, between Gospels, you get, in some instances, in many instances, shall I say, very significant discrepancies between the statements made by different authors recounting what are supposedly actual events.
Do you have any examples of these, Pat?
Now, come on now. Of course I've got examples. Plenty of examples. Well, there's, so I guess they fall into two categories. Again, the things that are consistent or inconsistencies within the Bible, and the things that you say, well, that couldn't possibly be true. Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things you find is when you talk about things like Christ walking on the waters, or manufacturing warehouses full of food from, a few loaves and fishes, people say, well, he's God, damn it, he can do it, Mm-hmm. So that sort of, in a way, that puts an end to the argument. I mean, what can you say? I mean, if you're going to say that anything is possible, he can do anything, then it makes, there's really not much room for discourse, which I guess is sort of the root problem of religion to begin with. But there are some areas that you can examine where the Lord makes statements that don't fit logically with what we know about society. I guess in Mark 10:12, he makes a statement, if I can find it for you here, about divorce. If a woman divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. Now, the point here is that in Hebrew law, a woman could not divorce her husband. A husband could divorce his wife, mm-hmm. but to make a statement that when a woman divorces her husband, would be nonsensical at the time that Christ lived, in the society that Christ lived, because women could not divorce their husbands. That would have been a great step forward for them.
Yes.
Maybe, some people have made the statement that Christ was a feminist, and this perhaps could be one thing that they could cite to bolster that argument, to say that, well, Christ supported the right of divorce for women. But I don't think that's what really happened. Apparently what happened, these words were put into Christ's mouth by a Gentile who was unaware of the fact that women could not divorce their husbands. So, that's, to me, obviously, a major error, mm-hmm. But that's only the beginning. There's other examples. Another example of both a contradiction and a case of strange behavior on Christ's part would be when he cursed the fig tree. Now, this is recounted in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 21, verse 19, and then Mark, chapter 11, verse 12 through 14. Mm-hmm. Now, this is an instance where Christ was returning Jerusalem, I believe, on a road after, I think this was sometime closely following his ejecting the vendors from the temple. And he was walking along the road, and he saw a fig tree which had leaves. Now, when you read the description in the Bible, Christ walked up to the tree and found that it had leaves, but it didn't have figs. Now, one gospel even says it was not time for figs, mm-hmm. so they were out of season. But Christ apparently was still greatly displeased, and actually said to the tree that it shall not bear fruit. And the tree withered. Now, that's, I guess, the point of the inconsistency comes in when the withering, because in one gospel, in Matthew, he curses the fig tree, saying, "You shall not bear fruit," and it withers immediately. Mm-hmm. In Mark, it does not wither immediately, but the next day. When they come the next morning, they find that the tree is withered. Then the apostles are amazed. Because aside from the inconsistency of whether it withered first or whether it withered the next day, the question is, why was God cursing the fig tree? That's one question. The other question is, in the description, he walked up to the tree and looked around and says, "There's no figs." I mean, he's God, he's omniscient, Maybe if he wasn't omniscient, at least he had, supervision like Superman, and he could see over there and say, no figs on that one, and he'd just go by to the next tree. But, it raises a lot of questions about mm-hmm. what, if Jesus did exist, and that's a big question itself, what kind of guy was he anyway? He goes around talking to trees. Nowadays, I guess you talk to your plants to make them grow. He talks to plants and kills them. Now, the next poor guy that comes along, you know, she could be a poor person that's walking down the road. It's in season. The tree's dead. Thanks a lot.
Right.
But I could go on and on. One other example I wanted to mention, one that Steve, our cameraman for the night, will appreciate, was the tie-in to flat Earth. Now, as you know, when Jesus was fasting in the desert, he was taken by Satan to a high mountain, and it says that he could see over all the kingdoms of the earth. Obvious implication being that the earth is flat. You reach a very high point, you can see everywhere. Now, of course, we know that the earth isn't flat. Even if you were on the moon, you couldn't see the entire planet without waiting for, well, I'm not an astronomer, but you'd have to
wait for it to rotate. Yeah.
Rotate. You'd have to, at a point above the earth, if you were stationary, you could wait 24 hours and see the whole planet, let me put it that way. But you can't see the whole planet by standing on top of a mountain, as is implied by the Bible. There's other references in the Bible that make it, give you the impression that they thought the earth was flat.
Well, I'm sure they did. Pat, the resurrection is the major miracle or central doctrine of Christianity. Are there any inconsistencies in the resurrection story?
Well, there's a bunch of them.
A bunch of them?
That's really an amazing thing, because you do think of the resurrection as being really the thing that Christians point to as being, boy, that's the biggie. He came back to life. Okay, and you would think that in this one critical part of the whole story, they could get it straight. But there are a lot of problems, even in the story of Christ's resurrection and his ascension into heaven, by the way. But well, one of the big areas of disagreement is exactly how long this guy was dead. Okay, now, you know, I can read them all for you. According to Matthew, in chapter 12, anyway, Matthew, he was in the grave for 3 days and 3 nights. Then Matthew chapter 27 says he rose after 3 days. And Mark chapter 8 agrees with him on that point. He rose after 3 days. In Mark chapter 9 and Luke chapter 24, he said to rise on the 3rd day. And in Matthew chapter 28 and John chapter 20, he was buried on Friday in the evening, a.m. So it's like,
it's a day and a half.
A day and a half, you know. So, you know, minor point maybe, you know, but I think, you know, they could try to get these, you know, these details straight. You know, then there's other things about, well, you know, I think one of the book of Acts actually says he wasn't crucified, he was hung on a tree. But one of the good stories in the Bible, though, is really about what happened. I guess this was in Matthew chapter 27. At the time of Christ's death, there was an earthquake at the moment of his death, I suppose. It was an earthquake which opened graves, and the saints sat up in their open graves. You know, there's earthquake. I don't think that happened recently in San Francisco. They didn't report any graves opening as a result of the earthquake, but this was a special order. Okay, the graves opened up, and at the time of his death, and the saints. Okay. I think it said the saints arose. But they apparently, it goes on to say that they went into Jerusalem, but not until after Jesus rose. Okay, so he died on Friday apparently. He arose on, well, Sundays probably, but you know, so I don't know. They hung around the graveyard or something. But when Christ got up, they joined him and went into Jerusalem. Now the weird thing about this is that, you know, this is in Matthew chapter 20, verses 50 to 53. Nobody else mentions this, you know. I mean, this is like Night of the Living Dead, you know, literally an earth-shaking event. And the guys, don't put that in. You know, they're saying, we don't need that. The Bible's got enough good stuff in it already, you know. Okay, you know, you got zombies walking around, you know. There'll be plenty of movies telling about that kind of stuff later. Let's just focus in on the important stuff, you know, like cursing the fig tree. Okay, so I don't know. It sort of makes you wonder when they omit stuff like that. It's, you know, that's one of my favorite stories, though. Just, you know, I don't know why they don't put that in every story of Christ's life. Is that part there? Because maybe if they wanted to, they could dig up some of the old footage out of Night of the Living Dead or something like that and stick it in. You know, there's a lot of old horror movies that probably have footage that they could use. You know, save themselves a few bucks in the next biblical epic.
There you go. Pat, has the church doctrine actually been influenced by some of these stranger stories that you've been telling me?
Well, sadly to say, yes. I don't know. You know, the church doctrines are odd enough, you know, that you wonder where they got these ideas from. I guess in one of my favorites is Paul. Paul had some pretty weird ideas. I guess you could spend a lot of time talking about him. He sort of, you know, you could think of him as one of the seminal influences of early Christianity, although if you use that term, I guess it might be a little ironic because the guy was, you know, apparently asexual, you know, and had a real thing about sexuality. Matter of fact, in First Corinthians, he says that people would be better off unmarried. Now, you know, one of the things that Paul sort of dwells on is this thing about Christ coming back very soon. You know, he believes that the second coming is right around the corner. I'll just read this to you. This is 1 Corinthians 7. What I mean, brothers, is this. There's not much time left, and from now on, married men should live as though they were not married. Okay, so he's saying that, okay, he doesn't want, I think elsewhere he says he doesn't want people to marry, and then he says, he even goes on to say that if you're married, you should live as if you're not married. Now, that's going to cut down drastically on the Christian population. But if you...
I can see that.
Right. Well, I guess if you think God's return is right around the corner, it doesn't make much difference, you know. You might not have time to mess around anyway. You know, you don't want to get caught with your pants down when the Lord's coming back. But it's, you know, it's really interesting because that attitude, which sort of elevated virginity to some sort of very positive intrinsic personality trait, you know, is really seen in a lot of other aspects. Not that Paul by any means originated it, but this whole thing about the virginity of Mary, you know, seems sort of tied in with the same mindset. Thing. Now, the Catholic Church even goes beyond that and says, well, not only was she a virgin, you know, at the time of Christ's birth, the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception, but she remained a virgin throughout her life. Now, the hard part about this is that in Matthew chapter 13, verses 55 through 56, they mention Christ's brothers. Okay, he had James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas. And he also had sisters. So
the implication is, of course, they were all immaculate conceptions if she remained a virgin.
Yeah.
Or
well, Christ got first billing, obviously. He got his first. Primogeniture is very important in those days, I guess.
Okay.
But
so it didn't amount to much in their case.
Well, I think what they say is, you know, what they do is they try to laugh it off and they say, well, these people may have been referred to as brothers and sisters, but they weren't really. This was just, you know, a liberal use of the language. Now, I don't. If you read Matthew chapter 13, 55, 56, you get the impression that they actually were brothers because he does say that, yes, these are my brothers, but you're all my brothers. He doesn't say, yes, these are my, he says, you're all my brothers. Okay, and if they weren't his real brothers, what point would it say would he be making by saying, you're all my brothers? So, but, you know, that's an important thing because then they also have the assumption where Mary goes into heaven. Christ, you know, Catholics have a thing about the Blessed Virgin Mary, and she supposedly goes into heaven. That's another thing that's common really to other mythical characters that Christ went there. I guess even they said even Augustus was assumed into heaven. You know, there's a whole litany of people that supposedly were assumed into heaven bodily. So there's other things that, you know, said in the Bible, like in John chapter 15, verse 6, Christ suggested unbelievers be burned. Now, this is pretty serious. It's done in somewhat poetic terms. I think he says these unbelievers are like dead branches, and the dead branches should be burned. These are the approximate terms he uses. Now, the only problem is we're talking about life and death here.
Yeah, that had some terrible implications for unbelievers as time went on, like the witches in Salem, and not to mention the Inquisition and...
Yes. They, burning was quite a common means of execution for many centuries, and there's a lot of places in the Bible where there's extreme violence, and you can find quotations, but when it's coming right out of the mouth of Christ itself, these arguments about, well, that was the Old Testament, these are the New Testament, even that can't be used to ward off these types of violent suggestions. So it's rather sad that these outrageous statements have continued to carry so much weight in view of the fact that the Bible is filled with such inaccuracies and inconsistencies.
Well, it's also been translated many, many times, and surely translation errors have crept in there and caused some problems too. Do you think this has happened?
Well, yeah, that's another thing that people, the defenders, apologists for the Bible, have oftentimes seized on, is the fact that the Bible has been translated from, into, well, many different languages actually, but through different stages at different points in time. The problem there is, to me, is with the whole concept of divine inspiration, okay? Now, they'll tell you that the divine inspiration was really only valid for the original writing of the Bible, in the original languages it was written in. The problem was, to me, well, there's several problems with that, but the Bible was written not at the time these events actually happened. I guess the newest of the Bibles was, let me see in my notes here, the newest of the Bible was written probably at the least about 90 years, about 90 A.D., and there were some distance removed from the actual, occurrence of the events. I guess that would be Mark is the one. It was written at the earliest about, the estimates I read, about 70, and at the latest 90. So here you have the people that are writing it are almost undoubtedly not eyewitnesses to the actual events. They have taken this oral tradition from other sources who may not themselves have been eyewitnesses to the event, and they are writing it down. And supposedly you have this doctrine of this act of God to somehow guide their minds to give them the correct words, or the correct recounting of the incidents. Now, the problem is, though, that we don't have any of what they actually wrote, okay? They will tell you, when they defend the inaccuracies of the Bible, they'll say it was divinely inspired, and yet you don't have anything that was actually written while this doctrine of divine inspiration was in effect, because apparently it doesn't carry on a generation. As soon as you translate it into another language, you lose the divine accuracy, or whatever you want to call it, of the Bible is lost. Now, I even wonder if these guys wrote it. We don't have the original manuscripts. Does divine inspiration count for transcriptions? I mean, if you were to send your manuscript into your publisher, and you wrote your manuscript under divine inspiration, does the finished product that comes out, or does even
he get to edit it? Is that
well, suppose you're writing it. You got terrible penmanship, okay? Somebody looks at it and has can't make out some of the words. They fudge it, okay? What happens to divine inspiration? I mean, it might have some currency if perhaps they had the original text of the Bible, the original, I guess, papyrus, or sometimes they would even write these things on little sheets of metal. If they had that, then maybe the whole concept would have some application to the Bible. But since you don't have the original manuscripts, since divine inspiration doesn't cover for errors of translation, and presumably not even for errors of transcription from the original sources, then what relevance does it have to these books that we have here?
Okay. Pat, what do you think are some of the major take-home lessons here from looking at all these inconsistencies and errors in the Bible?
Well, one thing is that it really I don't want to be too hard on the Bible, okay? I mean, there's a lot, it's got a lot of value in terms of the folklore that it contains. What it tells us about the society, the people that much of our culture is derived from is really priceless. Mm-hmm. I think you should appreciate that. It's from a historic point of view, from a literary point of view, it's a great work, no doubt about it. But the thing you have to see in it is the humanity, what it does tell you about people. Mm-hmm. It's very, very important, very valuable for what it tells you about people. What it may be for what it tells you about people's conception of God, what it tells you about people's ethics, their moral standards, how they form their ideas. Mm-hmm. But in terms of giving you an insight into some absolute reality in and of itself, you have to realize that's where the limitation is. It's not capable of doing that. Freethinkers' perspective, to establish a dialogue between freethinkers and the religionists. We can sort of communicate with religionists about that, through the Bible, about things in the Bible, and see that, you know, we have what we can agree on, what we can't disagree on. But the thing is, you have to,
they get very defensive when you question the Bible.
They do.
When you point out inconsistencies, it's almost impossible to carry on a realistic dialogue with many of these people.
Yeah, well, we're sort of running out of things we can talk about, you know. There's abortion, but actually what the hooker here is that many religionists feel that they can persuade you just as you feel that you can persuade them. So you need to engage them on that level, to talk to them about there might be people that are watching this show because, you know, they feel that they somehow would, you know, have a position that's superior to our position intellectually, and they feel that they would, you know, like to learn something from this show that they could use to persuade people of like mind. Okay. But the main thing is communication and exchange of ideas. Also, you know, we have to really be aware of people that want to base public policy on the Bible. That's a very, I think, a real danger. There's, you know, Christian Reconstructionists running around that, you know, would like to make the Bible really one of the source documents for our law. Once you learn what's in the Bible, you realize how dangerous this is.
Well, we had times when religion ruled the world, or at least Christianity ruled Western Europe. It's called the Dark Ages. And I think if people studied the history and the Bible together, they might not be so anxious to go back to that type of society.
Well said, Barbara. You know, well, I'd like to just read you here what one writer said. He said, deviation from the reconstructed society would carry a severe price. In the Old Testament law, homosexuals, blasphemers, career criminals, Sabbath breakers, adulterers, incorrigibly misbehaving children, and non-believers received strict punishment and sometimes were put to death. So put all those categories together, that takes in a pretty large segment of society.
I think it does, Pat.
But there's one thing last thing I'd like to say about the Bible is, you know, that you should remember is if you want to tell the truth, never put your hand on the Bible.
Thank you. And we'd like to thank our audience for being with us today. If you want to express your opinion, whether you agree with us or disagree with us, write to us at Box 2931, St. Louis, Missouri, 63131. Thank you very much.